Hello and welcome to TK Physical Education. In this episode, we'll be looking at the respiratory system and covering all the information that you need to know for the GCSE PE. So we're going to start by looking at the main parts of the respiratory system, and that is the lungs, the respiratory muscles, which is the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, and also the airways. So let's look at that diagram of the respiratory system in a bit more detail. So when we breathe in, there are two different ways that the air can come in, through the mouth or through the nose. The advantage of breathing in through the nose is that the air has a little bit more time to be warmed on its way to the lungs, and also that it can be filtered by the hairs in the nose, and as it goes through the nasal passage, you have hairs on the lining of the wall called cilia. Now these cilia actually filter out any bacteria and particles of dust that are in the air, and that means that the air will be cleaner as it comes down towards the lungs and easier to breathe. After the nasal passage, we have the pharynx, which is also lined with cilia, which helps for filtering that air. And then the air goes through the epiglottis, which is a trapdoor, which makes sure that air goes down into the trachea and separates it from the food, which is going to go into the esophagus. After this, we have the larynx, which is also known as the voice box, and then the air moves down into the trachea. Okay, the trachea is the main windpipe. Once again, it is also lined with cilia, which is going to the small hairs which are going to be filtering that air. And from the trachea, the main windpipe, it breaks off into two bronchi. Okay, an individual one is called a bronchus, and one on it, and together they will be called the bronchi. Now the bronchi lead the air into each individual lung, where they branch off into smaller airways called bronchioles. The bronchioles branch off, many of them, and eventually lead at the end to something that's called alveoli, which are the small air sacs in the lungs where gaseous exchange takes place. And the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. I'm going to be talking about those in a little bit more detail so that we can see that process of gaseous exchange. Also part of this respiratory system, we have the respiratory muscles. So we have the diaphragm, which is at the bottom of the lungs, which will actually move down and contract when we breathe in, and it will move up and relax into a dome position. I'm going to be talking about the mechanics of that breathing and how that affects air pressure in the lungs a little bit more later in the video. Along with the diaphragm, it's also important to remember that in between the lungs, we have the intercostal muscles, and these have the same job to raise the size of the chest so they contract when we breathe in and relax when we breathe out to change the size of the chest so the breathing can take place. As the lungs are going to be moving a lot when we're breathing and they're moving against the ribs, they need to have like a slippery surface to make sure that there's not too much friction so that the lungs can do that function. And that's something that's called the pleural membrane, and the pleural membrane surrounds the edge of the lungs, making sure that it's got a slippery surface for respiration and breathing to take place. Next, we're going to be looking at gaseous exchange and the site of gaseous exchange, which is the alveoli in the lungs. The alveoli are the small air sacs that are found at the end of the bronchioles, and this is the place where oxygen is delivered to and then is transferred into the bloodstream, into the capillaries. Now the alveoli are very good at this gaseous exchange for many reasons. Firstly, because of their structure. So they are spherical in shape and they're very small. So there's millions of alveoli in the lungs, very small little spheres, and these spheres have a very large surface area. In fact, if you were to flatten out all of them, you would in fact cover the area the size of approximately half a tennis court. Now that's a very big area, which means it's got a huge surface for that gaseous exchange and that swap of oxygen and carbon dioxide to take place. The other reasons that the alveoli are so good at this exchange of this gases is because the walls are very thin. In fact, only one cell thick, and also the capillaries that surround them are one cell thick as well, which allows the gases to pass through the walls, from oxygen passing from the alveoli into the capillary and carbon dioxide passing from the capillary into the alveoli. This means there is also a high diffusion gradient. So that means that the concentration of oxygen in the alveoli is very, very high compared to the concentration of oxygen in the capillary, which is low. And then for the gas, moves from one area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. Okay, so looking at the mechanics of breathing. So we have the main respiratory muscles that are responsible for us to be able to breathe in and breathe out, and that being the diaphragm, which sits at the bottom of the lungs. In a relaxed state, we sit in a dome position. And then we also have the intercostal muscles, which are in between the ribs, and these muscles will be able to lift up the rib cage to make sure we can increase that size of the chest. So inspiration means breathing in, and when we breathe in, it's a bit of an effort. Okay, so to get the air into our lungs, we have to contract our muscles to make sure that we expand our chest. So breathing in, we make our chest bigger, and the way this happens is that the diaphragm actually contracts and moves down to raise the capacity of our chest, and the intercostal muscles contract and move up at the same time. So inspiration, making that chest bigger, and it's a bit of an effort, so the muscles have to contract. Expiration is the opposite, and it's easy to do. It's much easier to do, so the muscles are relaxing. So when we expire and breathe out, all we need to do is relax those muscles, and the intercostal muscles come down when they relax, and that will reduce the size of the chest, and the diaphragm will actually come up. So when we breathe out and relax, the diaphragm will come up back into that dome position and reduce the size of the chest. So breathing in, when we make the chest bigger, what we're actually doing is lowering the air pressure because there's more space for the air. And this means that air is drawn in through that trachea into the bronchus and down into the alveoli of the lungs. And the opposite, when we breathe out, so when we expire, we reduce that size of the lungs, increase the air pressure, and because the particles of air have got less space to move, they're forced out. And that's how the mechanics of breathing work. So when we talk about respiration, what we're actually talking about is something called aerobic respiration. The concept of getting oxygen into the body and being able to use it to make energy for exercise. So with aerobic respiration, what we're really doing is taking oxygen and adding it to glucose, which we get from our carbohydrate. And by combining those two together, the oxygen and the glucose, we can create energy with the byproduct of carbon dioxide and water. And that is the equation for aerobic exercise. Now, aerobic exercise means that we are able to work for a long time, for example, running a marathon, but as long as we're working at a steady, reasonable, moderate pace. If we start to exercise much, much faster, so we're doing it like a short blast, like a sprint or perhaps powerlifting, then it's no longer possible for us to work aerobically for the whole duration of that exercise because the body will be demanding so much energy in such a short amount of time that there may not be time for that oxygen, the process of it for coming through the lungs and being pumped by the heart around the body. So consequently, we need to produce our energy, something that's called anaerobically. Okay, and that is almost like the opposite of aerobic exercise. So what anaerobic exercise does is it takes that glucose that you've got from eating your carbohydrates and your food, and what it will do is it will actually be able to, the body can produce energy from that glucose with no oxygen at all, but only for a very short period of time. And the byproduct of that, so you've got your glucose making the energy, but the byproduct will be that you'll get lactic acid in your muscles, which is a poison to the muscles, and it's going to make them very, very sore. And it's going to mean that the performance is going to need to eventually stop after a short amount of time because of the pain caused by the lactic acid and the fatigue that causes in the muscles. So we have two types of exercise, two types of respiration. We have aerobic respiration, which is slow and steady and perhaps working at a more moderate pace using oxygen. And we also have anaerobic exercise, which is much faster, like a 100-meter sprint or throwing the shot put or powerlifting. And that explosive exercise, the anaerobic work, does not use oxygen, but can only work for a very short period of time. Okay, so the composition of air. Now, although we've talked a lot about oxygen being breathed in and carbon dioxide is what we breathe out as the respiratory process, that process of aerobic respiration, in fact, the composition of air around us is not 100% oxygen or even a split of carbon dioxide and oxygen. The majority of the air around us and what we breathe in is in fact nitrogen. So 79% of the air that we breathe is nitrogen, but we don't do anything with that air. We breathe in 79% nitrogen and we also breathe out 79% nitrogen. So it just comes into the body and out of the body, and we don't actually use it to create energy. The bit that we're interested in is the 20% of air that we breathe in that is oxygen. Okay, so we breathe in 79% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, and a trace of carbon dioxide and other gases. So a very, very small amount of carbon dioxide that we breathe in. We use some of that oxygen to make energy, but we don't use all of it. So when we breathe out the 79% nitrogen, we then breathe out 16% oxygen and 4% carbon dioxide, because we've used 4% of that oxygen that we breathed in, turned it into energy, and the byproduct being carbon dioxide. So breathing in 79% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, and a trace of carbon dioxide, and breathing out will be 79% nitrogen, 16% oxygen, and 4% carbon dioxide. Now this actually is important because it allows us to be able to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on someone, and this is the reason why it's possible for a lifeguard or for somebody doing CPR, a first aider, to actually get oxygen into another person's lungs, because we still are breathing out 16% oxygen, and it's not a case of breathing out completely carbon dioxide. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at lung volumes. Now there's a few different lung volumes and rates that we need to remember for the GCSE PE exams. And the first one is called tidal volume. Now what tidal volume means is the volume of air in one breath. Now that can just be a small amount. So you can see on the graph, as the graph comes up, and we breathe in, graph goes up a little bit, and breathe out, graph goes down a little bit. So in is graph going up, and out, graph going down. So that's the volume of air being breathed on that axis there. Now the tidal volume can obviously change. So it's going to be at rest just a small amount, although it's actually approximately 500 milliliters. So half a liter of air is what we're breathing in at rest. But that can actually go up to nearly 3 liters when we're exercising. So obviously you're going to take much, much bigger breaths when you're running, perhaps, or when you've just finished a race, or you're playing a different sports or game, because your body has a higher demand for oxygen. So we already talked about the body wants to make the energy aerobically, so we need more oxygen into those muscles. So the tidal volume, the volume of air in one breath, can increase when we're exercising. Now, how much can it increase to? So the next key volume that we need to know is called vital capacity. Now, vital capacity, you can see on the graph, is when you breathe in as much as you possibly can, and the graph comes right up. And then once you've breathed in as much as you can, you breathe out as much as possible. Now that means that the volume of air in vital capacity is maximum inhalation, breathing in as much as you can, followed by maximum exhalation, then breathing out as much as possible. That's called your vital capacity. Now that can be measured using a balloon. So I'll show you an example of vital capacity using a balloon. So first of all, breathe in as much as you possibly can for maximum inhalation. And followed by breathing out as much as you can. And what you can actually do is measure the diameter of the balloon and compare it to a graph to find out what your vital capacity will be. Okay, just let the air out of the balloon there. So you will see also on the graph that even once we breathe out as much as we can, there's still not got to the very bottom of the graph. And in fact, there's still some air left in your lungs. There will always be a little bit of air left in your lungs. And this air is called your residual volume. Now, the residual volume can also change. For example, when we're at rest, there's going to be a very, very high residual volume because we're only having a small tidal volume. But as that tidal volume gets bigger and we start to take bigger breaths, we're going to be using up more of that lung capacity, meaning that the residual volume will be coming down. Now, in terms of rates, we have very simply the breathing rate. Now, the breathing rate is the number of breaths that you take in 1 minute. And on average, that tends to be about 12 breaths per minute. Now, if you get your breathing rate and you times that by the tidal volume, you will find out how much air is being breathed by the lungs in 1 minute. And that is called the minute volume. Okay, nice and easy to remember. Now, minute volume would be 500 milliliters of tidal volume times 12 breaths, giving you roughly 6 liters of oxygen or air, that you're going to be breathing approximately per minute. And obviously that can also go up hugely when we're exercising, as the body needs to have more oxygen. Right, so understanding the short-term and long-term effects of exercise on the respiratory system. So in the short term, which means going for a run or doing a short amount of exercise, and what the results of that are going to be on the respiratory system, obviously there's going to be an increased demand for oxygen in the muscles because the muscles need the oxygen to create the energy aerobically. So in order to do that, we're going to have an increased breathing rate. So the breathing rate is going to go up from that 12 breaths per minute and can go up to maybe 25 breaths in a minute when we're exercising. And also the tidal volume. So remember I said that the volume of air in one breath, so it can be just a small amount, just that tidal volume is going to increase massively. So it can increase from 500 milliliters, half a litre of air at rest, going right up to 3 litres of air when we're exercising. This is going to mean that we're going to get increased gaseous exchange at the alveoli, so more oxygen in and more carbon dioxide removed from the body, and more oxygen is going to be delivered to those working muscles. Long-term effects of exercise. So in the long term, you would expect that the structure of the lungs is going to get better because we're going to be training perhaps 4 or 5 times a week, going on long cardiovascular fitness, continuous training, jogs or cycle rides, and the structure of those lungs is going to be much, much better, and they're going to mean that we can get even more oxygen into that body quicker and more efficiently. So the things that structurally are going to change are they're going to produce more alveoli. There's going to be more alveoli for gaseous exchange. You're also going to produce more capillaries around the edge of those alveoli, meaning that diffusion process is faster and more efficient. The diaphragm will become stronger. It's a muscle, so from constant use and exercising it under pressure is going to make sure that diaphragm is stronger. I mean, we get bigger breaths into those lungs. Intercostal muscles again are going to get stronger, and all of these changes mean that the lungs are going to work better. So the vital capacity, that volume of air that you can breathe in and out maximally, is going to get bigger because we've got more alveoli, we've got a stronger diaphragm. So consequently, you're going to be able to get more aerobic energy and work aerobically for longer with these stronger, more efficient working respiratory system. Thanks for watching TK Physical Education on the respiratory system. I hope that that's covered the topic in good depth and good detail for the questions that you're going to tackle in the GCSE PE.